put in the chat here.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Self Pub Sunday. Today, we're joined by I.Anonymous, author of Gurzil, which we'll talk about in a little bit. His second book out, Bandon Hill, which I haven't gotten to yet, but I will some point when my TBR lightens up a little bit.
Yeah.
So, welcome, everyone. Um,
Hello.
so let's talk a little bit about your writing career first and let some folks trickle in. So, have you always wanted to be a writer? How did you get started in writing?
I was always my getting started in writing has taken a very long time. Um, I was always a very big lover of books, um, especially classics and all of that. Um, Very big on the whole idea of always been big on mythology and trying to piece together how what it meant to the people at the time. What did King Arthur mean at these different periods of time that people have written about King Arthur? Because like Robin Hood and James Bond, every generation rehashed Arthur. There has always been a new Arthur kind of coming out. And originally, when I started sort of writing, I was writing steampunk novels. Um, that was sort of my original start there. And trust me, if anybody ever sees me put out a steampunk novel, you probably want to walk away because that's like me on a cash grab, and it really wasn't. But that's the problem. It really wasn't. The first couple books you write probably aren't going to be good. They're going to be full of self inserts and things that your therapist and your mother might be interested in, but nobody else. Uh, once and it's really hard, and a lot of people don't get out of that bubble. I think people really there's a lot of resistance to getting out of that bubble. I think for a lot of writers, um, sometimes it's that they've just gone world building disease. And I will say this: we all do world building disease, but I like to think of it not as world building; it's world breaking. Lewis Carroll said when Lewis Carroll wrote the Narnia was talking about Narnia and all of this, he said it should be a world more real than your own. So when you're building these worlds, it should be, that was one of the hardest things for me, I think, was building this world that wasn't this complete new and original thing because everybody wants to make the new original world. I want to make the world of fire and ice, or Middle Earth, or Narnia. But all of these worlds are based off of worlds that we know.
Right.
They're based off of history. Certainly, some of them, like certainly Game of Thrones and uh, Tolkien's world, are based Middle Earth are based completely off of history.
Mm-hmm.
You can sit there, point to the period of time, and say, "This is it." Um, so when you're building these worlds, you gotta kind of sit there and go, "I'm working off of a piece of history," and I certainly, eventually, I just embraced that fully. I mean, if you've read my book, you see that it begins with the quote from the historical source that I was using. And people go, wow, it must have taken you so long to go through all those sources. And I'm like, not really. The Wars of Justinian isn't that long a book. The Secret History is a pamphlet. Sure, it can take a while to slog through all the King Arthur novels, but they're still shorter than a Brandon Sanderson novel.
Yes.
You go read the Stormlight. We've all read these are people that have read the Stormlight archives. I'm like, I could fit all of the research materials that I had to read and actually sat down and read through in the Stormlight archives because that's all there is.
Mm-hmm.
There's just not enough there's not a lot of history. There's giant gaps in it that you could drive trucks through. And in that I sort of constructed my story. But as for how Gurzil came around. You are going to laugh because you've read Gurzil. It began as a children's book. Yes, yes. That it doesn't sound like possible, does it? But it began really as this story of, I kind of saw that I wanted a story that, reflected just the diversity and the ethnic diversity of the time, and didn't really like how a lot of certainly Arthur is probably King Arthur, stories like Merlin, the really terrible one recently, Cursed, and others have all tried to basically just say, and this character is now going to be ethnic. We're going to throw a bunch of ethnicities and we're just going to pin the popular characters with an ethnic character, cast them that way, instead of saying, why don't we just give the actual ethnic characters back their speaking lines that we took away from them in the Renaissance in the 80s and the 50s. There is, you don't need an African knight. There's a real one right here. He's dating the blonde Princess Isolde. He's a real character. He's not a bit part, but we've taken him out and never brought him back. And certainly Princess Sabra fell into that category. She's a Libyan princess. Why do we always portray her as this blonde? There was also the attitude, certainly you'll see it in the second book, Barden Hill, with the character Guinevere, but there's been others, Isolde, and certainly in the first book falls into this category of, when you read King Arthur, you also have this attitude of, they almost, in the Renaissance and then in like the 40s and the 30s, in Hollywood got a hold of them and everything, they are like the hostage girl.
Yeah.
Like, but when you read the actual, especially the earlier legends, like out of things like Garrett and Enid, you go, these aren't hostage girls. These are, they're commanding, they're like being left in command of the castle because all the men had to go off and fight. And they're holding the castle, or they're serving as scouts, or they're serving as diplomats or messengers. They're not the front line where or they're healers. And the one that I think put it best was actually, I did not like this game, but it had a really good line in the beginning, where in Elden Ring, which is an Arthurian type video game, it came out and said, you're going to die. Basically just comes out, the NPC comes out, and your first NPC you meet goes, you're going to die. And why? Because you are maidenless. So you don't have anyone to heal you. You don't have anyone to make introductions at the keep. No one's going to let you in. So you're just going to die a terrible, horrible death. And when you read King Arthur, the characters that don't have a female counterpart, or lose their female counterpart, or totally piss off their female counterpart, die horribly. Like, Tristan is certainly one of the best examples. Like, leaves the paramour with the abusive husband and gets an infection and just dies. Yeah. Guinevere is the definition of the girl that you go, and I'm going to save Guinevere, and they get there, and Guinevere's like sitting having dinner with the guy going, yeah, I sorted it all out. He's our friend now. What is the, like, we slayed dragons, we vanquished armies to get here, and you'd already made a deal? And so I have a daughter, and so the story I wanted to write was very much for her, and so that we could have a female character. So I tried to write very good female characters, and I think I did. Came out pretty well. And then certainly Gurzil just came out way more menacing and evil than I ever expected him to. He turned into this like almost just diabolical villain. And it all just got a lot more. Some of this was just so good that eventually it just like gave up the YA and just completely embraced the grimdark here.
So, let's talk spoiler-free chat about the book Gurzil. For those people that are watching that haven't read the book yet,
You should read the book.
Can you give us kind of an elevator pitch about what Gurzil is, the heart of Gurzil, what the book is about?
Well, the heart of Gurzil is sort of how is two different stories. It's two different stories that we kind of realize are going to merge together. And a lot of the people that read Gurzil, one of the first things I think they say is, like, I had no clue how this was fitting together for the first 100 pages. Like the stories that you have don't seem to coalesce together until you're about midway through the book, and suddenly you're seeing how these two places go. And certainly through the series, the connections start to really come together, because the history comes together. Mm-hmm. And in one arc, we have George, who is a knight in Britain, and he is the last sort of grandson of the former High King, because who was King Lear, and that comes out of one of those little known pieces of Arthurian lore is that King Lear was one of the Britain kings prior to Arthur and Uther and all of them. And I kind of moved him a little bit in his plot line because he's he's probably, other than King Arthur, he's probably the best known of those sort of character arcs, we'll call them, in there. But he's the son of Urian Bertilac, who is in Arthurian legend the Green Knight, mm-hmm. and the grandson of King Lear, who was King of the 100 Knights, who is actually a very interesting Arthurian character that, again, not many people know about, but is actually one of Arthur's main antagonists through most of the beginning of the canon Arthur myths. And so he's out there, and he's sort of facing a major crisis. Britons have a major crisis. There's a Saxon ambush at sort of the peace summit, and now they have to and most of this is him contending with sort of the beginning of the invasion. So they killed all the Saxon nobles, and now they're moving on. Cedric and all of the Saxon army are making a big push here. And George sort of runs a reaction force and recruits some allies, but his primary goal through this is to sort of get to the battlefield before the Saxon army, and and make sure that there's sort of some sort of defense. We also have, Arthur and Merlin and other characters are also sort of responding, but he's sort of the first one to get there. And at the same time, down in North Africa is Sabra, who's in she's one of these daughter of one of the desert chiefs. And she's working to sort of counteract a lot of what's going on in Byzantine Africa at the time. So she's working and one of the biggest things that's happening is that there's been this rise of a cult that has really taken over her home city, and is what part of why her father has sort of sent her away to live with the nomads, and she's sort of contending and trying to figure out what the cult's goal is, why the cult is going there, and doesn't really realize sort of until later that the cult is actually being run by this dragon Gurzil. And one of the more interesting historical features here is that Gurzil there really was a cult of Gurzil. The whole piece there is actually one of the more historically accurate parts of my story. Now, he's not usually portrayed as a dragon, but nobody really knows what he looked like. He's sort of this second tier um, Phoenician deity that sort of almost came with I'm going to say almost a Carthaginian resurgence during that period of time. And so it's sort of how both of these characters and how they fit together, and how the dragon is sort of a connection between them. And we definitely get the impression that they will meet up later. That how is sort of, I leave that for it's spoiler free, so no one knows that. I haven't figured that one out yet. I know, actually, no, I do. I have, but I haven't written it yet. And that's sort of the elevator pitch of the story. A little bit long-winded, but
It's a long elevator ride.
it's a long elevator ride. We're going up a ways. Call it the subway pitch. You sat on. We're going on a train.
So you spoke a little bit about this earlier, but what makes your book and your story different from, say, other Arthurian legend stories that we might find?
Well, the biggest difference, I think, is that unlike most Arthurian fiction, even the more historically accurate stuff, it all focuses around King Arthur in Britain, sort of almost, and often even smaller than that, like just in Camelot.
Mm-hmm.
When in the actual the fact is that at that time there was still a lot of movement. We're still at the in the 5th century, when Arthur is believed to have lived, there was a lot of connections between them and various other factions that were moving around. The whole point was that you were dealing with sort of this Saxon migration that had come over almost 100 years before, and sort of split Britain sort of in half, very much in the same way that it would get split in half again, in the Viking era that everybody's more familiar with. And so the parallels between those are kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But the biggest difference, I would say, is that I wanted to show how this would have reacted to everything else going on in this world at the time. How would this have where this would have gone, how what's going on in Britain would affect what was happening in the Mediterranean, especially with, the Byzantine Empire sort of trying to reclaim the Roman territories in the Mediterranean. You had a lot going on. You had a lot of people moving around. And surprisingly, when you look at the sources, you see mentions of, especially of Britain. Because Britain, one of the interesting facts when you look at it is that Britain was not this unknown place. It was in the later Roman Empire, it was really the headquarters of. You had multiple emperors that had successfully launched basically full-on rebellions that would go on to conquer huge portions of the empire, starting in the 3rd century with Constantine, and then going up to the 4th century with, again, Constantine, with the Britain usurpers, which were like 3 other guys, which I mentioned briefly in the books. So though you had this very cosmopolitan, and it was, what was happening was affecting everywhere, right over to even as far away as places like China. The Silk Road was a big deal at this point, and you ended up with a lot of stuff happening with that, and a lot of stuff happening with the Saharan trade. And a lot of this was really a attempt. This was sort of the Rome had fallen, and the world was really up for grabs, and people were trying to grab what they could.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the we see this. We're familiar with this one story of that. I think we're familiar with the Saxon invasion and the Britain and King Arthur and all of that, if only from watching Netflix Vinland. But we're all familiar with that bit. But it was happening all around the world at that point, and I kind of wanted to show. So Arthur became sort of the hook I put into this, to this familiar place with these familiar characters that you sort of, if you didn't know them, you knew of them. Mm-hmm. And they have these brilliant archetypes like Guinevere, Arthur. And one of the great things when you're writing Arthurian literature is that you get to sort of pick and choose what aspects of each rendition you enjoyed. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, if you read Gurzil, you'll certainly feel a lot of Morgana. The Morgana in Gurzil feels a lot like the Morgana in Merlin, who I think was probably that television show's best character. You also will see, Arthur is such a dynamic character and has been portrayed so many different ways, and I think everybody has their own take on Arthur. And in this book, I wanted Arthur to come off as really the character that probably would be a better king than he should be, was probably the right choice for king, but would be in his own way something of a tyrant. And in many of the books, he's presented as, this was a strong king and he did some stuff that was questionable. And at the same time, I didn't want to. So the other point I will say is what sets it apart from other Arthurian books is that it is very much set from the point of view of sort of Camelot's adversaries. Mm-hmm. We always see Arthur from the point of view of his allies. But but you gotta kind of ask yourself, what were the enemies thinking? From our enemies' point, from a lot of Britain's point of view, you could argue that this is an individual that wants us to give up our independence so we can all go party in Camelot. And that's always what it strikes me as, not so much almost to unite on one side you could say he's uniting the realm, on the other side you could say he's subjugating it. And certainly the biggest difference is how I portray is the inclusion of North Africa. And I do that, and that was sort of part of the St. George motif, because one of the main legends of St. George is that he was a Briton knight that was a contemporary of King Arthur's. And a lot of the legends, certainly in Fairy Queen, he fights beside King Arthur and everything, but he's never a knight of the Round Table. Mm-hmm. And I found that in itself very interesting. And I found a lot of the stuff that was happening in North Africa at that time very interesting. And that was a legend that allowed us to link the two.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about how this started off as a children's story. You're writing a YA story for your daughter, and then it kind of exploded from there. what came first, the story or your characters?
I think the character. I want to say that that's a really hard one because these are characters that I've grown up. One of the first books I ever was read when I was a child was Beowulf,
Mhm.
and he certainly there is certainly Grendel and Beowulf and all of that, and they will feature much more prominently in subsequent novels. But you know, so King Arthur, Beowulf, Tolkien, these are characters I have grown up with and had sort of perceived notions of. You know, what was Lancelot? Well, you know, I didn't really like a lot of the portrayals of Lancelot because oftentimes Lancelot is either portrayed as this awesome guy, this awesome knight, Richard Gere in First Knight, this person that you should wanna root for. And the other times he's portrayed as just this complete, womanizing jackass. And I didn't like either one of but usually if he's portrayed in the second tier, he's portrayed as totally, not this formidable figure.
Yeah.
He's just this guy that, self promotes himself and, looks good.
Yeah.
He's that popular guy in school that actually, if you put him up against, that can't actually, I should be quarterback, but you can't actually throw the football.
Right.
But I want to say I'm the quarterback. I wanted to portray him differently. So I would say that, and certainly characters like St. George, when I went looking for the actual character and said, okay, well, let's go find out what was written about him, figuring that I would find volumes of original documentation and found nothing.
Right.
I'm like, really? One of the most revered figures in almost every Western faith, be the Muslim, they're revealed by the Muslims, Christians. You even find, even Jewish references to him, and you just go and there's nothing. Really, nothing. I'm like, I even go and look for like the canonization and stuff, and go looking that up. I'm like, he's a canonized saint. There must be something there. It comes out and says, one of my favorite lines, George is of the saints, who's justly revered by men, but whose actions are known only to God. And I'm like, that is the biggest cop out if I've ever read one. Like, we have no clue. We're just gonna say this.
Right.
And so I sort of came up with the story. So I want to say that they kind of almost happened simultaneously, because the story and the history and how they moved together, it was like, it really did feel at times, and as I said, it kind of blew up, because as I started doing the research, I found that it all seemed that the history and the myths and all of this started to fall together. And the big writer's question is always, what if? So as you wrote, what if this character did this?
Yeah.
What if that character did this? What if this character was this kind of person or had this background? And that's what drove the character. So a lot of what drove the story was coming up with what this character's background would have been. And that's part of why it's all this multiple POV and why there is so much backstory referred to in these chapters. Because I said, so for instance, with Sabra would be the obvious one. So Sabra, what education would this woman have had at this period in time? And she's the daughter of a powerful trade center, of the king of a powerful trade center. So she would have had education in languages, which is something you see her in the beginning. She has lived with these desert tribes for all these years. So she has some knowledge of desert warfare, of hunting, of riding, of bowcraft, and took that and said, this is what that person would have.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, versus a character, say such as George, who was the son of a powerful warlord. He was raised by a king who then like abdicated his throne and became a monk. So what would he know? So he would have been taught history. He would have been taught warcraft. He would have been taught, battlecraft, not so much warcraft.
Right.
He would have been taught, the scriptures.
Yep.
And you go in and you say that, and then I even, in the process of all this research, came to a really strange conclusion, realization that I think is something that you have to accept if you're going to read medieval literature. And that is, you have to say what almost every, sorry, when you read medieval literature, almost every character sorry, almost every character corresponds to a biblical hero.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was partly because of who was writing the stories at this point.
Right.
They were being written usually by people that had some sort of ecclesiastical upbringing. Geoffrey of Monmouth was certainly was a monk.
Yep.
And whereas Geoffrey of Monmouth was a knight. And you can see the contrasting differences between how those two people wrote. But when you look at King Arthur, you see it pretty much all of it. He's all about going, what would King Saul from Kings do?
Mm-hmm.
Really does follow even the rise and the fall and the mistakes he makes sort of fall into that character arc. Mm-hmm. And so there's that question of what would who this character would have related himself to.
Right.
So in George's case, I have him relating himself to Samson. In Arthur's case, Saul would have been his hero. Mm-hmm. And that's very much the case with the Christian characters.
Yep.
And then I put in characters of like, for instance, Lancelot and Galahad. Mm-hmm. If that's just a what if statement. So what if Lancelot had a son? Well, he would have been very young when for my entire age gaps not to get weird, he would have had to have been very young when he had this son. And then he would have come over and then been Lancelot. And why would he have left? Why would he come over? All of those questions then drive the story, I think. And certainly Gurzil falls into that category too, but Gurzil's much more evil, and his backstory defines how evil he is, and as you learn, but just like any other character, I think J.R.R. Martin puts it best, nobody is the villain of their own story. Gurzil doesn't see himself as the bad guy, so why is Gurzil doing what he's doing? And a lot of people you can look at Gurzil in the first bit, and certainly a lot of characters look at Gurzil and go, he's just evil and just wants to eat people.
Right. Well,
but
it's funny you bring that up because I think that's a good segue to go into our spoiler chats.
Okay.
So, if anyone out there that hasn't read Gurzil yet and you don't want to be spoiled, go read it and then come back and watch this. So it's funny that you bring up Gurzil and his backstory because that's like the specific question that I had written down very specifically about Gurzil is that to me, and perhaps I missed it in reading it because I've read a lot of books at one time, and so sometimes things get lost to me.
If you missed it, I'll let you know.
5 books, but I kept I read Gurzil and I kept thinking, okay, to me, what makes a good villain is not that he's evil, but that his backstory fuels his character. And to me, I was missing that backstory and that motivation. It seemed like Gurzil was just evil for evil's sake, and I needed that backstory
Well,
to make him from villain to good villain.
you're going to, the backstory on Gurzil is, I hate to say it, a very slow build.
Okay.
I kind of give, I almost only give through, I actually have a rule. Every book only gets 3 Gurzil chapters because Gurzil needs to be, when Gurzil shows up, it is not Gurzil doesn't show up for no reason.
Right.
When Gurzil makes his appearance, it's like the lackeys have dropped the ball, people are gonna die, heads are gonna roll here. Um, I have some really big scheme I'm playing.
Okay.
Gurzil is playing a very long game here, and his backstory goes back a very, very long way, and it has its ups and downs. And by about book 6, actually in book 6, you will have a real, there will be the real question of, is Gurzil really is are there worse things than Gurzil out there? Certainly, once you read Baden Hill, you start to wonder, are there actually worse things than Gurzil?
Mm.
And then once you sort of get to the end of the 3rd book, which I've only just finished writing, you're going to go, Gurzil obviously has a big plan. This isn't like, he's not, trying to think of a good example. He's not, Dr. Claw from Inspector Gadget,
Yeah.
who's like, I have no plan, I have no stakes, I'm just bored, basically.
Right.
And me and my evil cat are going to do things. Um, there's a real, if you haven't noticed, I think you might have noticed in the reading, and certainly by Baden Hill, you get it. There's a real desperation in what Gurzil is doing.
Yeah.
Something is, he's up against, you almost feel it, like he's up against the clock here, and he gets it. Like, we've been around for 10,000 years, but now, okay, I gotta wake up and start, moving forward here, and I sat around a little bit too long here.
Right.
And realizing that he's sort of in a pickle. And Saba's, part of it is the definition of there are a lot of questions about Gurzil, and I leave those open and sort of only start answering those slowly. For instance, why is Saba so important to him?
Mm-hmm.
He obviously can get, there were other ways for him to get a girl. Why is this one girl so vital? What's so important about it? And that's something that will be explored later on. You also, what are the other big questions everybody has about Gurzil? Certainly in book 1, is, if Gurzil is such a badass, why is he not, out there laying waste to, these kingdoms that he wants to conquer, Vox Machina style, just flying around, nuking the places. And part of that does come down to the deal that he realizes that no, if he starts doing that, big things are gonna come down and kind of squish him.
Yeah.
He's being really careful. He's being really, for all of his sort of awe-inspiring power, he has to be careful. There are big forces that will just come and squash him like a bug if he does this. And part of what you'll see in Gurzil's backstory, as it's sort of revealed, is him surviving incidents where other Dark Lords were squashed like a bug. Very much like, and I think that's part of what makes a good, and I felt that that was part of what makes a good Dark Lord. You
Yeah.
know, it's not really explained in the original trilogy, but when you look at, say, Saruman, Sauron, you realize that he's survived other Dark Lords falling, and
Mhm.
he's had major upsets in his own rise to power. And so when he goes to do this the next time, this the sort of the final time, he's moving cautiously. He's moving slowly until such a point as he can't.
Hmm. So, who is your favorite or the easiest character to write?
Favorite character? Now that one's hard. Because I love them all. I would say certainly the most fun character to write has to probably be Gurzil himself. Gurzil is he's not a character that I can write a lot about, because he A knows too much, and B, if he says too much, he stops being terrifying.
Right.
Everything that comes out of Gurzil's mouth should be like, oh my god, he's so scary. Um, and he's deliberately doing that. But I would say that he's certainly the first character I wrote, and by many accounts, the most terrifying and one of the most fun to write. Um, Probably the other easiest and most fun character was in Baden Hill was Guinevere. Um, she was a great deal of fun to write, and she's an interesting character. You haven't read her yet, but she's one of those characters where, so we'll keep this one spoiler free, but she is one of those characters where it's been kind of almost funny because male readers read her and go, wow, I really liked this Guinevere. And female readers have read her and go, they didn't hate how she was written or anything. They just disliked the character as a character.
Yeah.
Like they didn't like her.
One of my
And
favorite things about Guinevere, so I've read a lot of different Arthurian legend retellings, and I took a class on it in college, so
yep.
we had like a whole semester of it there. But every instance that you meet Guinevere throughout literature, she's slightly different.
Oh yeah, no, and I
Never
think
the same. Like Arthur generally stays the same throughout
right.
different
Arthur,
retellings.
Lancelot, even,
But
but I
Guinevere
never
is
read two
slightly
Guineveres that were
different
the
in
same.
every retelling.
Right. Guinevere in Monmouth and Guinevere in Mallory are completely different
Completely
people.
different,
When
yeah.
you get and then when you get into Hollywood and you get into things like Excalibur, The Mists of Avalon,
Yeah.
all of these have Morgana is pretty much always the same, but Guinevere, I don't think I've ever seen two Guineveres. And so I would say that Guinevere is probably my own. And I've seen a lot of Guinevere's because one thing I saw in a lot of Guinevere's that I liked was I liked the idea of the warrior Guinevere. From the Clive Owen movie certainly was a good one. The Keira Knightley Guinevere, I think, was one of the. I think, I think the movie did not do that Guinevere justice.
Right.
And that was certainly what I saw her as. She's almost always seen as this northern princess.
Yeah.
So I looked at her and said, well, what would she have been? This was another one of those. What would this character's background have been? So I really thought that actually one of the best Guineveres that I always envisioned is Tolkien's Guinevere, which is from the Fall of Arthur.
Yeah.
And Tolkien has, this was an unfinished book, so there isn't much there.
Right.
But there is one great description that I thought summed up Guinevere. And sadly, I so wanted to put it as one of the quotes. And sadly, it wasn't worth the $2,000 that the Tolkien people wanted for it.
Gosh.
But it was, Lady, she called it Lady Ruthless.
Mhm.
And it had this whole very lovely poem about how, like, she didn't want to, how she like didn't want to give up all of her renown and splendor and all of this, and really regretted, having to go into exile because she was just this queen that really liked being queen.
Right.
And so I saw her. So when I saw her almost as like an Awen kind of character from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
This princess that had been brought up in what was a very warrior culture. She was the only daughter. She's almost always described as being the only daughter of Lendegrance,
Mhm.
and so she's really is in many ways that in Pictish culture at the time she would have been seen as the heir apparent to her
Right.
father's kingdom, and yet at the same time she would have had to compete with her cousins, with her brothers, and I gave her, certainly in Barden Hill, an entire backstory, which was sort of hinted at in book one, which was this entire war in the Orkneys,
Mhm.
which was one of those, which has always stuck out to me as one of those interesting facts about the Arthurian canon,
Yeah.
is that the Orkneys are always important. Why are the Orkneys? It begs that question. Why are the Orkneys important? Like
Yeah.
the king of the Orkneys. Okay, uh, excuse me. I've been to the Orkneys. They're this little set of islands way in the north.
Yeah.
Like they are not this central tactical location of like trade hub that if you read the Arthurian books, you think that
Right.
because Lot is a huge character.
Yeah.
And he's like, Morgana is a ghost, and they end up marrying into Arthur's family, and Gawain. All of these knights come from the Orkneys. Agravain,
Mhm.
Mordred, all of them.
Yeah.
And you're like, how could this be this important?
Right.
And I actually spent a lot of time working out why that would be an important situation and where these connections would come into. And I was able to then I kind of morphed that with Beowulf, where
Mhm.
one of the weirdest little lines in Beowulf is that one of Beowulf's exploits, Beowulf was written of the same period of time that all the Arthurian
Yeah.
canon was set. One of Beowulf's exploits is that he defeated a race of giants in the Orkneys. That's like, okay. So went back and said, okay, so we have attacked. So we have a war. We could say that the first, the Vikings went over there, and then we can have him fight them. And then at the same time, we sat down and said, okay, so what are they fighting for? And I spent a lot of time in the Orkneys. I was stationed there forever. Very weird situation, which we can't discuss. But and I said, okay, so what's up there? What would be up there that would have been worth all of this? And I did and suddenly I had that just realization of what was up there. And I did the Wallaces. There were Wallaces there.
Yeah.
And there were certainly considered to be a lot more Wallaces in early medieval times.
Yeah.
This is why the Romans claimed the Orkneys and everything else.
Mhm.
The Wallace ivory would have been important. And so I
Definitely.
sat there and said, well, if this is a Pictish colony here, and that's sort of how I fit the whole story together. I say, these little one-liners
Right.
of what I can grab and extrapolate an entire character off of that usually. And certainly Guinevere is one of the characters I'm most proud of how she came out.
Mhm.
Um, After her, I'd say another really good one is currently the character I enjoy writing the most is Fidessa and the other Byzantine princesses,
Mhm.
who are probably when I now that I've sort of finally dug into them and showed them and illustrated them, they are almost more terrifying than Gurzil in many ways. And it was another one of those interesting moments, because when you sat down and tried to write those princesses, when you tried to write these Byzantine, this Byzantine court, you realize that at this point in time, these sort of monarchs and people are the original sort of primordial soup from which all of the what we see as vampire literature comes from.
Yeah.
And so I kind of went with that, maybe off a little bit too far, but we'll see. I'll leave that to the readers when it comes out, probably next year.
All right. What was the hardest character to write?
Hardest character to write. Hardest character to write, without a doubt, was probably George, actually, which is ironic. Just because he's such a strange and dynamic character that getting him wrong, it is difficult. After George, it's probably Galahad. Fitting Galahad together and sort of mixing the two aspects that are Galahad, which are, this extreme faith that Galahad is always famous for.
Right.
You can't have Galahad and not have him not focus on his faith, because I don't care if you're Monty Python or if you miss that aspect, you've missed the core principle of who he is.
Yeah.
And you might get away with it, but not if you ever intend to use them for a Grail cycle.
Oh, sorry, good.
Go ahead.
Did you have a favorite scene in Gurzil?
I do, actually.
Okay.
My favorite Gurzil scene, I have two that I really enjoy, and probably my favorite scenes, the ones I reread, are definitely the Morgana scenes. So that first opening scene where we have George and Morgana, and you see their interaction, is certainly one of my favorites in Gurzil. Another one I really liked was her with the Consul of Glevin, with Eldol, where she basically goes into her whole backstory and just why she's doing some of the sketchy things she's doing. And then there's certainly the after that one, I would say it's the introduction chapter to Sabra, was one I really, really liked and had a really good time writing, where she just, because that one, ironically, that one is actually based off of a real incident in my life, where I went gazelle hunting with in the Emirates with some friends of mine back in the days where I was not a writer, which is why I'm I.Anonymous. But and yeah, we were with some other. I was with some other Americans. One was, people I didn't really know that well. I am a very accomplished writer, and he claimed to be. And so chasing a gazelle is not for the faint of heart.
Right.
This is not something that you should just, if anybody tells you, let's go chase a gazelle, it sounds like wicked fun. Yeah. And it really is. But it's like trying to chase a ball that's going to zigzag on a horse that it believes its only purpose in life is to follow that zigzagging animal perfectly.
Right.
And so you need to be really strong and know what you're doing and how to stay in a saddle quite difficultly. And then while you chase this animal, because otherwise you end up, like the Texan or like Sergius, and you just take a digger into the sand.
Okay.
And so that is one of my favorite. That was actually one of the first scenes I wrote for Sabra, and probably about the time when it started to move away from a children's novel, I think, was where I kind of realized that no, this was going to be a lot longer of a novel than I expected it to be,
Right.
and B, because just how it was. And I will say this though, when doing all this research was rewarding in its own right, because, for instance, when you look into the wars of Justinian, especially what's going on in North Africa, you then need to go sit down and read Dune, especially the first two, because when you read Dune, you will see precisely how this whole storyline matches up. And you'll feel a little cheated. You'll go, but I thought it was so original. And you'll go, not really.
No.
Certainly Sergius and his brother and his uncle all but parallel perfectly with the Harkonnens. And you see the Atreides and all of that. And it really was an interesting, you obviously studied medieval lit. And, it's always one of those interesting things as you read other books and you go, sometimes you read them and go, wow, that was so cleverly done and so perfectly, adapted. And then other times you'll read them and go, if I wanted to read that story, I would have just read the original. And I hate to say it, some of those have been in some of the cases, those books have been very disappointing for me in fantasy. And I say fantasy because it's just sometimes usually notorious for it. Certainly the one that comes to mind when I say things like that is Sword of Truth, where it's like after books 1 and 2, he just seems to be lifting the Ayn Rand novels and then putting them to a fantasy setting. And it's like, I liked Ayn Rand. I don't like this. What happened?
Yeah. So you've hinted at future books earlier. Do you have the whole series planned out? How many books in this series are you?
The whole series has more or less been edited, outlined out. Obviously, I do not get. I want to say this say that doing this show is a double-edged sword. You have to stay open and loose because as you move forward, you're going to have other ideas and other things that you realize that people really liked that might not have been what you originally thought, but characters that you made that people turned around and said, I love that character so much, or that character just starts coming out so well that you need to really evolve them. So I'm trying to think of a character. Oh, I know what the character is. The two biggest ones for that one would have been Kasim and Kahina. Originally, these are all but throwaway. When I made them originally, they all but came out as throwaway characters that were supposed to they were cannon fodder. They were going to die horribly, rather quickly. And then somebody made me a bet at one point that while I was sort of finishing up Gurzil's draft and said they were a shifter fantasy writer and we were in something of a spat, as you often get as beta readers often get. Less so, I find, in the booktube, but there's a lot of, when you get into the actual writers groups, especially the more cult-like ones, you find that there's some pretty big egos involved. Like, my series is going to be the best. And, one of the ones that you always have to, go and never try to write a slow burn novel. You will fail. You will fail. You're not going to get in there fast enough. if you're saying this is going to be a slow burn and I'm going to take my time with the world building, you know, you're going to, what you feel as the author of the world building and how you're going to fit all your puzzle pieces together is probably about 10 times slower for the reader.
Right.
So you think you're moving just at a slow burn, and your beta readers are coming back and going, "What is happening?" And I'm halfway through this book and I can't figure it out.
Yeah.
You need to kind of sit back and have that come to Jesus moment. The other one is, the other thing you have to be really careful with, and probably why fighting George is so hard for me, is you got to be really careful with the self insert.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be that character that feels most like your own voice. And you have to avoid the fact that you want that character to sleep with the most desirable of your other characters. They have to sleep with that girl that friend zoned you in high school. They have to do all of these things that you have not yourself managed to accomplish in life. And while that can be very therapeutic to write, you have to pull yourself back from that precipice and say, no, we're not going to fall off that cliff. And so, it is plotted out at the moment for 9 books. It may very well become 10 because I tend to hit a certain point and try to tell people, with this giant, you are not Brandon Sanderson. No one is waiting, wants to read your giant tome. Kate, your poor booktubers, they cry because they want to be nice. They do. They so want to be nice. But, Gurzil is little. And it's still hard to convince people to fit this into their TBR because they have to figure it out. And they have to go for volume. But, part of it is when I wrote Gurzil, and people have mentioned this one as well, that, it feels like it got like there was more to it. Like it almost ended with a cliffhanger. Now it ends at a point where there has been some resolution.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sort of always sit down and say, if you think there was a point where your plot line had a resolution and you are at a book length, it's time to cut it.
Right.
Because it's time to screen cut, go click, and put an ending to it, and then begin again with the next book. If you can cut your book in half, and for a self-publishing point of view, the reason for doing this is that cost is book length. Profits is number of books.
Right.
You get paid pretty much. If you're a self-publishing author, your book is going to sell at $2.99. More than that, that is the number that KDP basically says, this is what your self-published novel should sell at. Mm-hmm. You should not sell it for less than this. Otherwise, we won't give you all the lovely little benefits of being Kindle Unlimited and A+ content. And we're going to give you lots of things for pricing your book a little bit more than you probably want to. And we're going to give you, and we're also going to say you have to be exclusive to us. But let's be honest, who buys ebooks on anything but Amazon? I have never met anyone. I have polled people. This doesn't happen. Just go with the Kindle exclusive deal. It's better. It's worth it. It really is. And so a lot of it is the fact that I try to take my ego out of writing. The other point is that this isn't my last series. This is the series that I'm making because I have a better series in mind, but I'm not good enough to write that series yet. I know Arthur very well. I could, it's certainly a good series, but I will argue that it allows this has so much broadness to it that it allows me to test different characters, different types of characters, different voices. Um, it really is kind of a lab thing, and it allows me to do. And sometimes strange things help. Like as I said, I was bet by a shifter author that basically turned around and said, "Well, if you can't write shifters," and I did that, I can write shifters. I'll tell you what, I will write were hyenas because everybody wants to write were hyenas and nobody does. They just sound badass. They really do. I'm going to write hyena werewolf shifters. And obviously, when you sit down, this was another one of those where I went and I tried to find a character that would fit for my my hyena shifter queen, and I did the she, she who must be obeyed. Now that is an awesome name for a hyena matriarch, because hyenas in themselves are very interesting characters. That they are a they are they're these very scary creatures. As far as animals go, they're probably one of, I will say, probably the most terrifying animal for most people. When you
Right.
look at them and when you hear them and all of that, they are scary. And then when you look into them more, you find out that, like, even in the mythologies, they are terrifying.
Mhm.
And then when you read like the science behind them, you find out that like there are these matriarchal societies, and these, the dominant female is completely in control of everything, and it makes for a very terrifying kind of character. And obviously the were hyenas didn't feature in the second book very much. Kasim comes back, but they were one of those characters that when I made them in Gurzil, they were there because I felt I needed more for the how Saba got out of the dream world.
Mhm.
When I originally wrote it, it sounded very, very basic. She gives Saba the counter spell, and Saba wakes up, which seemed a bit flat and like, okay, little lower stakes. It doesn't feel like, if all it took was, some sniffing salts, and we're out of the and we're out of the and the dragon goes away. It didn't feel as terrifying. If you have to actually summon something that, frankly, you don't want to talk to and is fairly nightmare inducing in its own right, you didn't you so being prepared for those kind of characters. And the other point is that I'm also gradually adding in other characters that I think fall into the category of, if I told you what they were, you would go, that doesn't make much sense.
Mhm.
But if and bringing them in has to be gradual.
Yeah.
But there are a number of other literary characters and historical figures from the same point of time that you wouldn't expect. And sadly, as I said, one of them would be, I have a I add some Chinese characters into the next novel, and sadly, the next novel has a lot of Byzantine characters,
Mhm.
and they are in their own right rather terrifying.
Well, I think that's a good segue to wrap it up.
Yep.
I wanted to thank I.Anonymous for joining us today. Thank you all for joining us and watching, and tune in next week for episode 5, where we'll be joined by Baptiste Pinson Wu to talk about the Yellow Sky Revolt. So
I am
thank
actually
you all.
reading that. May have to
Oh,
join you for that conversation.
yes, it'll be next Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time.
Ooh,
So
okay, so I have to step
oh,
up. I have to step up reading that one. I have to take a break from Berserk.
it's a great book. So yeah,
I
thank
have
you
heard
guys
good
for
things.
joining us, and we'll see you all next week.
Goodbye.